honored to be joined today by two very distinguished gentlemen to react to the really rather unprecedented ruling from the ICJ, finding that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. We have Mouin Rabbani, who is a researcher, analyst, and co-editor of Jadaliyya. Welcome, Mouin. Great to see you.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And we also have Norman Finkelstein, who, of course, is a noted activist, author, and scholar as well. Great to see you, Norman.
Thank you for having me, Ms. Ball.
It is my pleasure, as always. So I know both of you have given extensive analysis already about your initial response to the ICJ ruling. So I wanted to move the ball forward a bit, and people can check that out on Katie Halper's stream and other places as well, where I thought you all had a fantastic conversation. Mouin, I was wondering if you could pick up with some initial thoughts about how this ruling impacts and implicates the U.S. because of our complicity and our unconditional support for Israel in their assault on Gaza.
Yes, well, of course, the ICJ ruling of last week is binding not only on Israel and South Africa, but upon all parties to the Genocide Convention, and that includes the United States. As you will probably recall, Secretary of State Blinken described South Africa's case as meritless before it was even presented to the International Court of Justice. And I think that's because the United States considers any initiative to hold Israel accountable for anything to be by definition meritless. But in this case, it has, I think, also clear implications for how the U.S. deals with Israel, in the sense that the court found this is a plausible case of genocide. This plausible case of genocide is being implemented with U.S. weapons and with U.S. diplomatic protection. And the U.S. will, if it wants to conform to the provisional measures issued by the ICJ, have to adjust its policies. But in practice, of course, it's going to go full steam ahead.
What do you think, Norman, about how this implicates us? And what have you made of the U.S. reaction so far? I saw John Kirby, and really gaslighting comments saying, well, they didn't find them guilty of genocide. Well, that wasn't the question that was before them at that moment. And then, of course, also on that same day that the ICJ is ordering Israel to increase the amount of humanitarian aid into Gaza, we took the action of cutting off funding to one of the key aid agencies that would provide that humanitarian relief to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Well, on the first question, namely the U.S., the implications of the decision for the United States, there are two aspects. There's number one, what Mouin just mentioned, namely the U.S. is a party to the Genocide Convention, and so it's bound to enforce the convention as any other state that's bound by it. But there's a second aspect. There are many aspects of genocide. There are many components to genocide, according to the convention. There's committing genocide. There is failing to prevent genocide. That's a separate category. There's incitement to genocide. And then there's a category called complicity in genocide. So this is not just a case of the United States being bound to implement the Genocide Convention. If Israel's committing genocide, then the U.S. is guilty by virtue of the Genocide Convention of being complicitous in genocide. So the United States is directly being implicated if it's the case, and now a plausible case has been made, that Israel is committing genocide. On the second question, namely the cutting of aid, there are many reactions to it. And actually, my innards began to writhe, as they often do, probably around twice or three times a day, every time I contemplate what's going on. The obvious explanation, and here I want Mouin to chime in because his memory is as good as mine, and maybe even better at this point.
I doubt it.
And so he can correct me or amend what I have to say. And I have many things to say. Let's start with the basics. Let's assume everything that's being said is true, that several of the militants involved in the action on October 7th, several of the Hamas militants were employed by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. It's the main humanitarian organization on the ground serving the Palestinian refugees from 1948 and their descendants. Let's say that were true. Let's say for argument's sake. I'm sure other of those militants on October 7th, they worked in banks, they worked in bakeries, they worked in schools, they worked in every aspect of Gazan life, which is to say, brace yourself, stop the presses. Hamas militants had the day jobs. That's the whole of the story. Now, you might think, I'm trying to extenuate something which Western officials anonymously told the New York Times was horrible, atrocious, awful. Even the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, said he was shocked and appalled. Shocked and appalled by what? No, if militants were involved, if Hamas militants were working in UNRWA, then of course they should not only be fired, but they should be prosecuted. But they should be fired and prosecuted as militants who committed crimes. It has no implication whatsoever, zero. Not even Israel has alleged that UNRWA was privy to the fact that these employees had engaged in these activities on October 7th. That's not been said. So for me, it's a stupendous non-story. It simply means Hamas militants had day jobs. Now, where is the evidence? There's this cretinous reporter on the New York Times. Actually, they're all cretinous, frankly, whether it be Isabel Kirshner or Ronan Bergman, who are effectively Israeli plants in the New York Times. These are Israeli reporters, and now they have a bunch of other ones, this guy Boxerman, all of whom used to work for these Israeli rag publications. In any event, what's the evidence? Now, I'm not going to deny it may be true, the charge, but what's the evidence? The evidence is the phone messages and text transcripts. Now, we've heard that before. You might recall during the bombing of Al-Ali Hospital, Israel presented these phone messages, which were immediately ridiculed for being obvious forgeries. So why would we at face value take this evidence of phone messages and text messages without any further evidence being presented? So I should also point out that we've had so much Israeli disinformation since October 7th. The same reporter, Patrick Kingsley, who's now talking about the phone messages and the text messages in this Israeli dossier, the secret dossier, which they've given the New York Times access to. We already had, it was Kingsley who reported on the Al-Shifa Hospital Command and Control Center, which never happened. It was Kingsley who reported the day before the ICJ decision, the day before, the headline the Times is a 400-page Israeli dossier proves that the orders by the Israeli government was to obey humanitarian law in Gaza. All of these revelations, which are completely devoid of any factual basis, So why should we take this one any more seriously? Now, I want to be clear. May be true, but where is the evidence?
Yeah.
Where's the evidence?
Mouin, I wonder if you could help people understand. There's this clip that's floating around now of a former Israeli official in front of the Knesset in early January saying, we need to destroy UNRWA as part of our war. We'll never win the war until we destroy UNRWA. Can you help people understand the long-standing upset of Israelis over UNRWA and even core to their very mission?
Yes, this goes back decades, as you've implied. And I think the issue to understand here is that the actual target of this Israeli campaign, which I think more accurately could be described as an Israeli-US campaign, because there's been anti-UNRWA hysteria for decades in the US Congress and elsewhere as well. The real objective is to liquidate the Palestinian refugee question by basically putting forth the claim that Palestinian refugees do not exist. And in this fantasy world, the reason that Palestinian refugees exist and believe that they're refugees and have become convinced that they have rights is not their own experience, but it's UNRWA, because UNRWA provides them services, because UNRWA purportedly has developed this fake identity for these people as being Palestinians, as people who have rights, as people who have rights to return. None of which is, of course, true, because UNRWA is a humanitarian agency. It has no formal responsibility for, the resolution of the Palestinian refugee question. But in this broader scheme of things, UNRWA has become the surrogate of choice for Israeli, US, and European attacks upon the Palestinian refugee question and their efforts to liquidate it. As you may recall, during the Trump administration, Jason Greenblatt, Trump's Middle East envoy, went to the UN Security Council and explicitly called for the abolition of UNRWA. And more or less claimed, that the Palestinian refugee question was this concocted illusion. If I can just make one more point in response or extending upon the point Norman just made, Chris Gunness, the former UNRWA spokesperson, I thought had a very good analogy in the Guardian newspaper this morning, where he said that the way in which these Western governments have now immediately suspended their funding to UNRWA in response to these allegations would be the equivalent of the British government severing funding for the British National Health Service because of Lucy Letby. And for those who don't recall, Lucy Letby was an NHS nurse who was tried and found guilty and convicted of murdering multiple infants in British hospitals. And the Lucy Letby case is, in fact, much more serious because she was using her job in order to commit her crime. So this is very clearly not about these allegations, which, as Norman said, may well be true, but given their source, need to be treated with healthy suspicion and skepticism. This is really about a larger political issue, getting rid of the Palestinian refugee question. And that explains this quote you started out with in your question.
Yeah. And Norman, central to the ICJ ruling was the inhumane horrors that Palestinians in Gaza are being subjected to now, including the levels of starvation, the lack of medical supplies, and of course, the total destruction of civilian life and the mass killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. But that humanitarian situation really loomed large over the entire report because, of course, it constitutes collective punishment. Some of the comments from Yoav Gallant in particular saying, we're going to institute a complete siege. These are human animals and they'll be treated as such were specifically cited in the ruling. So help us understand then the cutting of funds for the main on-the-ground humanitarian agency on the very day when the ICJ is saying you have to provide more humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip?
The news of that day was, of course, the ICJ opinion. And as the opinion was announced in the news media, it was almost as quickly displaced. And suddenly the headlines, instead of being about the instead of being about the ICJ opinion, the headlines suddenly became about UNRWA. And by the next day, there was one story in the Times on the ICJ opinion, and there were two stories on UNRWA. And it was just so obvious if you watch the coverage. Fortunately, your generation doesn't read the Times much. Mine is the last generation which will have endured that experience. If you watch the coverage, it was quite clear what was going on.
Transparently so.
Yeah.
When the ICJ case began, immediately the New York Times resurrected the rapes issue on October 7th. Now, there have been many stories already on the rapes issue. I'm not going to trivialize it as an issue. I will simply state that it had been amply reported on, and indeed it had been amply embellished. But it was suddenly resurrected just as the ICJ hearings began to unfold. And as it happened, this particular resurrection was particularly shoddy in its reporting, although the Times hasn't yet acknowledged that. Then came the revelations from this secret Israeli dossier proving that Israel had carried out, or the soldiers had been ordered to carry out international humanitarian law. And then came the new story with UNRWA. And
don't forget the 450, or was it 4 million miles of tunnels?
Oh, yes, I forgot. The 430 miles of tunnels, which incidentally, when I did a little research, I discovered that by that reckoning, there were more tunnels in Gaza than in the whole famed, ramified New York City subway system. So for those of you who know the New York City subway system, we have the A line, the B line, the C line, the D line, the E line, the F line, the G line, and so forth, till we get to the AA line, the BB line. Then we have the numbered lines, the number one, the number two, the number three, the number four, the number five. You take all of those subway lines, this sprawling New York City subway system, and then you calculate the number of miles of all the tunnels. And it took me a little time because I'm not web adept at the web. You discover the total number of tunnels run to 430 miles. But the New York Times is claiming, based on another secret, Israeli report, there were 450 miles of tunnels in Gaza. Now, remember, Gaza is a very tiny parcel of land. So do you know what that means, 450 miles? It means if you take the width of Gaza, which is 5 miles, it would mean every 1,200 feet along the width of Gaza, there was another tunnel stretching 25 miles the length of Gaza. So what was the purpose of that story? The purpose of that story was to say, of course, Israel bombed everything in Gaza because everywhere there was a tunnel.
Yeah.
So now we come to this one. I have to say, this has an element of sadism that leaves one kind of breathless.
Yeah.
Because there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza now. About 25%, a quarter of the population, is facing famine conditions. That would mean about 200 if there are roughly 2 million, it's more, but roughly, let's say 2.3 million people in Gaza, and that would mean about
460. 20%, you said, right?
Well, they're saying 25%.
Oh, so about 500,000.
About 500,000. And of those 500,000, half of those, or 250,000, are children. So 250,000 children facing famine. And in the midst of that, well, the United States, but not just the US, let's be clear about it. It's the US, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's Austria, it's the Netherlands, it's Britain, and one other country.
It's now the EU as well.
Wow.
Cutting off all humanitarian aid to UNRWA, which means, since it's the largest humanitarian organization on the ground, these people will face famine conditions, which is a euphemistic way of starving to death. And what's the reason? Well, as I said, even if it were literally true, and as Mouin elaborated on, it's a complete non-story. It just means Hamas militants had day jobs. But it was so obviously designed to distract attention from the ICJ opinion, and also, in my view, to punish UNRWA for the reasons Mouin already stated, or use it as an opportunity to get rid of UNRWA, but also because the head of UNRWA, his name is Philippe Lazzarini. He happened to be a pretty decent guy, as far as one can tell. I don't know him as my boss, but in his public persona. And the ICJ, in its decision, and the American judge who read the decision, she quoted him, Lazzarini, twice. When she was quoting the statements that attested to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, she quoted Lazzarini twice.
Could I just add to one brief point to that, Norman? That I think, yes, it was intended as a diversion from the ICJ by Israel, but it was also intended as revenge upon the ICJ by those who have cut off funding to them. In other words, you have the rules-based international order reminding international law who's boss. Oh, you think you can hold Israel accountable under international law? Oh, you think you can force us to respect international law? Well, here, enjoy the famine.
But that's the whole point. The sheer sadism of what they did to punish the ICJ for that opinion. They're going to starve the children of Gaza. Instead of, you could have attacked the ICJ, including your own representatives on the ICJ.
You do have the Hague Invasion Act.
But so cowardly and sadistic. I totally agree. It was obviously revenge.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, if what the court is saying is true, then all those states which have been supporting Israel are now themselves parties, but they're in the dock on the basis of that ICJ decision because they are acting in complicity. They're supplying the arms. They're voting in favor of Israel at the UN, the Security Council. They are in complicity with Israel and therefore guilty under the Genocide Convention. Just an aside note, the German representative in the ICJ, he wrote this 5-page separate opinion. It's called a declaration. And the German said that he does not believe that Israel's military operations are genocidal. But then he said, I have to vote with the majority because there were statements made by Israeli leaders which can be construed as incitement to genocide. So as I said, that's a separate count in the Genocide Convention. So incitement is one, but complicity is another. And so they use this UNRWA stitch-up in order to exact revenge on the ICJ, but they exacted the revenge by starving more children in Gaza. The level of sadistic cowardice. And I wrote this morning in this thing called a tweet. I said, I do hope that the great Houthi people, while on their humanitarian mission, take note of the ships from these countries. I won't go further because I don't want the plug to be pulled on your program.
Mouin, last question for you, and I hope you'll both come back and we can have an even longer conversation. But are you hopeful that this ruling or future ICJ scrutiny, as Israel is supposed to report back to them about, improvements in their behavior, and even, down the road, a year or so, potential actual finding of genocide? Do you have any hope that this will or already has shaped Israeli and American behavior?
I think it depends how you look at it. If your expectation is that a ruling by the International Court of Justice is going to have an impact on the situation on the ground, essentially seeing its rulings as something akin to a Security Council resolution, although those are, of course, also routinely ignored, then the answer is a clear no. These are not self-implementing or enforceable rulings unless the Security Council takes action, and it's not going to, because the U.S. would veto any attempt to hold Israel accountable. But I think it's a game changer in gradually transforming Israel into a genocidal pariah state. And this will have very significant moral and political, and perhaps ultimately even legal consequences. So that's why I think this ruling is of such huge importance, because it has completely shifted the way Israel is now perceived among key sectors of public opinion in Western states, without which Israel cannot wage this genocidal onslaught.
Yeah, I think that is all very well said. To both of you, your analysis has been absolutely invaluable and, might I add, courageous. Thank you so much for spending some time with us and helping our audience understand the implications of this ruling and other events.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.